I need someone to introduce me, because I have to introduce myself now. That's always a little awkward.
I'll do it.
Who said it?
I'll do it.
She's gonna introduce you.
Were you kidding?
Well, I think I was joking, yeah, I
Oh.
didn't.
I'll do it.
There's only three or four people that really know me.
Okay, I'll give it a go. So I'm Sherry Engstrom. I told you that I live in Lake Geneva. I teach humanities and writing at College of Lake County. And I write, and I travel, and I do a lot of other things. And I'm really living a good, adventuresome life. So what I've taken to do in my writing, which is kind of I wrote journal entries most of my life and academic stuff, but I'm really enjoying writing stories about my life, creative nonfiction. So the story that I'm going to tell you tonight is actually taken from a piece of writing that I did. It's kind of interesting to me, maybe it'll be interesting to a couple of you, but I took a graduate education class about 13, 14 years ago on adolescent development, and we had to write an essay about our adolescence. So this is my story from that paper that I wrote for class a long time ago. Kind of forgot about it, dug it out, used it in a couple writing classes and seminars, and now I've transposed it into a story, so we'll see how it works. Well, that was pretty nice, unexpected. I think it was a senior in high school when I probably started thinking about being a teacher, and I knew for sure in by college that I wanted to do that. But before that, I had always liked school a lot. I think partly because it took me out of the confines of my home, and I somehow felt like I wanted to think more broadly and just keep learning and learning. So I had a really good school experience, most of my schooling, which took place in suburbs of Minneapolis. So the story that I'm going to tell you is about my experiences in 8th grade, 3 little vignettes. It's called The Good, the Bad, and the Inevitable. Mr. Erickson, Mr. Bob Erickson, was my civics teacher in 8th grade, and he was so cool. He was handsome, suave, bronzed complexion, and he was the high school swimming coach. And so when I'd go there for free swimming, or maybe a lesson or two, I don't really remember. Again, I was in 8th grade. This was the fall of 1963. Go ahead, do the math. I would watch him from the sidelines, and again, he was nice looking. I wore a blue windbreaker over his swimming trunks, and he was just very intense, teaching his team how to swim and get better at what they were doing, coaching. So that's what he did when he wasn't teaching us in 8th grade, civics class. But what I remember about civics class and the way he taught it was he was very engaged. He never sat at the desk. I don't even remember that when he did that. When he did, he perched on the corner with one leg up and just very animated. And he moved around up and down the rows, always asking us questions, critical thinking questions. You know, what do you think about this amendment? Do you think we should raise the voting age? Trying to really get us involved at a very young age, which I really thought it kept me engaged, it helped me. And I also liked just watching him. Remember his red tie would kind of swing rhythmically as he was walking, and he wore a blue button-down shirt. Those were very, very in the mode in that day. He was so different from the stodgy older teachers. And he wore wallabies. Does anybody remember wallabies?
Yeah.
Seeing a couple of heads. These tan suede shoes that had these nice spongy, crepe or rubber soles, and he wore those. So he was just very, very cool, and one of my favorite teachers in 8th grade. And ironically, I didn't know this at the time, of course, but I ended up teaching civics along with the English classes I taught when I was an 8th grade teacher my first year of teaching in the 70s. I had a much more difficult school system than Mr. Erickson did, but I occasionally found myself thinking about that, because I wanted also to engage my students and make them realize what our government was about, what democracy was about, and try to get them involved. So that's my memory of Mr. Erickson. 8th grade literature class. On the shores of Gitchigumi, by the sparkling deep blue sea blue sea water, stood the wigwam of Nokomis, Nokomis, daughter of the moon. That's what my 8th grade literature teacher was reading, standing up. I don't remember her name, so I have to call her Miss So-and-so until it comes back to me. She was cute, she was petite, she had red curly hair, and again, you could tell she loved literature just by the way she presented it to us. And she stood up and, again, tried to get us engaged. And she said, asking us questions, let's talk about the character of Hiawatha, what's happening in this poem. And we were doing that, and then all of a sudden, crackle, click, the PA system came on. And the principal said, "Good afternoon, teachers and students. I have some bad news to announce to you. I'm sorry to have to tell you that President Kennedy has been shot in his motorcade in Dallas, Texas. And there were some attempts made to save him and surgery at the hospital, but he died. So I'm sorry to announce that your president has been assassinated." What? Silence is what I remember. And then there stood Miss So-and-so with her lips apart and crystal tears drizzling down her face. She stood crying in front of her students. Maybe some of us did too, but what I remember is her empathy, her sensitivity, her sadness. And, we could think about Hiawatha and the poem of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow if we wanted to, but what I really remember her teaching us was the poetry of life, all the way up until grief and violence and death, the death of our president. And the bell rang, and we walked dazedly out of the classroom. The hallways were certainly more quiet than usual. And I remember walking into the class that I liked the least from my beautiful English teacher's class. This class was algebra, for which I had no use. Geometry was okay, because I could visualize shapes in my head and it made some sense to me. Algebra, not so much. And this classroom was commandeered by Mr. Boyington. Mr. Boyington, and he was bland, he was boring, he was myopic, he was aloof, he was detached, he was clueless. He would stand at the blackboard like this all the time, teaching us like this. So we got to look at his backside while he lectured the blackboard. That's what I remember about Mr. Boyington. In fact, one day, two pranksters, two guys brought in a spool of thread, and they started threading it and weaving it all around the desk chairs and the seats, I think to prove how clueless and oblivious Mr. Boyington was. And they proved themselves right, because I have no memory of him ever finding or discovering anything like that. So that was the prank. But on this particular day, we came into class and we were talking. We were processing the information that had just really bombarded our innocence, right? All of a sudden, our president that was cool and handsome and was going to take us to the moon and fight against civil rights, fight for civil rights in the South, was gone. And we came into the room talking, and the bell rang. And in those days, the bell was sacrosanct, right? If the bell rang, that's it. No, we kept talking. And Mr. Boynton slammed his hand. That's enough. That's enough. Open your books to page 47 right now. The president is dead and there's nothing we can do about it. No more talking about it. And of course that stands out in my mind as direct contrast to what I had experienced just an hour before in my other class. And when I've thought about him, I've wondered, I don't think he taught us anything that day. I wondered if he learned anything from the experience that he had by just completely denying and ignoring our need to process this staggering information. The last teacher I'm going to tell you about is my earth science teacher named Mr. Russet. Now, Mr. Russet was creepy. I don't know why we thought so exactly. I'm going to try to give you a little bit of an idea, but we just thought he was creepy. So I can only wonder, in retrospect, why did my initiation into womanhood have to take place in Mr. Russet's class? So it's now spring of 1964. It's March 31st. Mr. Russet, I feel a little bit sorry for him now, but not too much at the time. He looked like a russet potato. He had a red face, and it was very pockmarked, poor guy, from adolescent acne, I guess. So he didn't really have that, attractive visual appeal that maybe helped us listen a little bit more to science lessons, I don't know. But that was Mr. Russet, and he had goldenrod hair, very wavy. He probably used Brill cream along with Mr. Boyington, good old Brill cream. And he had a couple of annoying habits that maybe gave us the creeps. So the first one was, men of the day always had white handkerchiefs. They put them in their trouser pocket or up in their jacket pocket. So he had one, but his was kind of grayish white, so we're kind of wondering about Mrs. Russet. Did she pay attention? Did she need to use tie? Did she like this guy? Did she love this guy? How? Why? All those things. But Mr. Russet was Mr. Russet, and he would lecture us, and he seemed to need to blow his nose a lot during lecture, or this is what I remember. Creative nonfiction, you do the best you can. You remember what you can, and I guess you embellish the rest. Anyway, so he would take out his handkerchief and blow his nose very loudly, like a big honk. But not only that, then what did he do with his handkerchief? He opened it to examine the mucus, like a scientist. Yeah, so like I said, he was creepy, beyond creepy. That was one habit that was loathsome. The other thing he did, it was, I don't know if he was a hands-on kind of guy or he liked visual aids, but he would sometimes ask for volunteers. So this particular day we're working on rotating on the axis, the Earth, right? Earth science. So he said, I need a volunteer. Darcy, come on up. Well, Darcy goes up, of course, silently, just following instructions. And Darcy was awesome and beautiful in my book. We were all Scandinavian, Northern European, Minneapolis. We all kind of looked the same. And here's Darcy. She's exotic, dark, very voluptuous bosom. Me, I was a ski pole, size preteen 6 with no curves or very small ones. And here comes Darcy. And Mr. Russet showed us how the Earth rotated on its axis. He kind of spun her around at the shoulders, but then his hands I don't know what they did. I can't even find a word for it. I don't know what I wrote in my story. He just kind of brushed around Darcy's large bosom as he's rotating her around. At least that's what it looked like. So, poor Darcy. Poor Mr. Russet, potato head. Poor Darcy. So he's done with Darcy. Darcy goes back to her seat. And then it's my turn for self-pity. Poor Sherry. I always got stuck in the back row because of my name was Engstrom. So Anderson, B, Carlson, D, E, I'm in the back row. So we're opening our books to do our questions after our lecture about Earth rotation and all that. And I was quiet, I was self-conscious at the time, and I felt crampy, and I felt kind of clammy and kind of uncomfortable, and I was kind of excited and afraid at the same time, and it was my 14th birthday. And the night before, my beautiful, elegant, dignified, fashionista mother had given me a white box-pleated wool skirt, spring wool, I think we called it, spring white, to wear to school the next day, and I did wear that. And I was just nervous and afraid that I was in for my womanly surprise. But I quietly sneaked out of my seat, smoothed down my skirt, and hoping that nobody would even look at me or sense anything. I was awkward, I was kind of afraid. I had to sneak up to creepy Mr. Russett's desk and say, "Mr. Russett, I need to go to the washroom." Thank you. It's a good thing it's Women's Story Night, if you get my drift. I mean, a man can't tell that story. Okay, so 14th birthday present. All right, we are ready for storyteller number 5, Mary. You're ready to go? Okay, this is Mary Norris, and retired librarian, Mary is. She's been a storyteller for 30 plus years. And her favorite stories to tell are historical, spooky, and she also likes to tell folk tales. Mary.
Thank you.
Oh. Ollie B.
All right, is this mic on? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, oh, good. 40 years before Laura Ingalls Wilder was living in the big woods here in Wisconsin, and about the time that both Kenosha and Racine were started, over in Michigan in a small prairie area, a little girl was born, and they named her Olympia Brown. And I came here today to tell you some things I have learned about Olympia Brown. I want to introduce you to her. Her father loved farming. Her mother didn't. Her mother was unhappy there. She missed all the hustle and bustle of living over on the East Coast near Boston. She wanted to go back, but she was married and she was committed, and this was the first of 4 children, and she believed in education and made sure by the time Olympia was ready for school, there was a school ready for her. And she also taught her many things at home. And eventually, Olympia was ready to go off to college. A year at Mount Holyoke, too conservative for her. Then she went to Antioch College in Ohio. And it was there she was called to the ministry. But she was a woman. What in the world was she going to do? She began applying to seminaries all over. No, no, and no. Until she applied to St. Lawrence University in upstate New York. She read the letter that she received back from them over and over and over. She did not see the word no. But she saw the word discourage. I discourage you from coming here. But she went anyway, and when she got there, the president of the college said, "What are you doing here? I thought I sent you a letter that said I discourage you from coming." And she smiled at him and said, "Well, your discouragement was my encouragement, and I'm here, and I intend to stay." And he said, "Yes, I can see that." And so she stayed, and she studied hard, and she preached hard. And she had a little room on the 2nd floor, and sometimes she would hear some of the all-male students mocking her in high falsetto voices, reading her sermons. And the very first thing she did upon graduation was take herself off to speech school where she learned how to make her voice beautiful and powerful. She was ordained the very first woman minister ordained by a major religious branch in the United States. The Universalists ordained her, and she went to Massachusetts and did not find it hard at all to find a position in a small church in a small town. And things went well until sometimes it only takes one, maybe two, starting to talk, starting the negative things that are going to happen. And she heard about it and thought, I'm going to leave before they ask me to. And she went to Connecticut and found a place. And there was a man who had been in the congregation in Massachusetts, and there he was in Connecticut. And he made his intentions known, and she said yes. And they were married. And in those days, there was a long period of confinement when a child was going to come. And again, they heard the stories of the disgruntled, the ones who wanted her out. And she looked at her husband and said, I'm ready to go, if you are. And then she found out there was another child coming, so they postponed that. But she started looking around. Where could she go? And she heard about a congregation in Racine, and they wanted a minister. So she wrote a letter, and the secretary of the congregation wrote back and said, don't even bother coming here. We don't have any money. No one's coming to church anymore. Everyone is sad and depressed about all of the things that have happened here. You're just better off staying where you are. But she got on the train and came to Racine, and she said, I am called to just such places. Well, of course, he could not hire her on his own. She had to try out. And she decided that she would reach every single parishioner before she even gave her Sunday sermon. Well, it was February in Racine. Oh no, it wasn't like this. It was rain. It was non-stop rain. The deepest mud she had ever experienced. There were no sidewalks in those days. A few of the merchants had planks out, and she marched up and down those planks trying to avoid mud that came up over her ankles, and she went visiting. Well, the river goes through Racine, and all the bridges had gone out. The only way to reach the parishioners on the other side of the river was to go by boat. But not the kind of by boat that you're thinking of. It was by boat, where all the boats were next to each other, and you went into one and crawled into the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and sure enough, she went down there. She was determined, and one of the men who was standing around watching said, you can't do that. A woman can't crawl over all those boats to get to the other side. And she said, oh, yes, I can. And she did, and she visited them all. And they came to hear her, and they liked it. But not everyone could go, so they talked her into staying another week, and she preached again the following, and they really liked her. And they hired her, and the year was 1878. Excuse me, 1878. Sorry about that. And so things went well. Oh, for the first 4 years, things went very well. There were no little groups of people that wanted to get rid of her. Oh no, they admired her, they liked her, but the church started having a lot of building problems. They needed money, they were desperate. And one of the wealthy men in that congregation, Jeremiah Increase Case, also known as J.I. Case, made a deal with the congregation. He said, I will put up half the money if you will increase your donations and put up the rest, but it has to be done in 10 days. And it was. About 5 years later, at the end of 9 years, the church was thriving, and Olympia was restless. Her husband was there. He had bought into the newspaper in Racine. The kids were coming along very well, going to schools in Racine. Her mother had moved in with them when the babies were born, and she was very helpful. Olympia was called to go back on the road. She had a message to deliver that was not religious. It was political. It was about the right of women to vote. And she wanted to tell everybody. She had spent months and months earlier in the state of Kansas, going around from one place to another, giving talks. Olympia Brown had taught herself to travel by herself, which was unheard of in those days. You had to have a companion, but she didn't need one. She was skilled in presenting information, in motivating people, but it was almost a lost cause. And she wanted to become more involved in that cause, and she did. She became the president of the Wisconsin group of suffragists, and she went all over the country giving messages, hoping that this would come about, that women would be able to vote. When she left Racine, when she left becoming a minister there, she was 52 years old. She was healthy, she was happy. The kids continued. Her husband died young. She was lost without him, and yet she wasn't. She continued her work. I don't know if you can imagine what it would be like to have one cause in your life, and you work year after year after year. She retired from being a minister in 1887. You know when women got the vote. It was a long, long time. But she never ever gave up. And finally, she was living with her daughter in Baltimore. It was 1920, November 2nd. She was 85 years old, one of the only suffragists. The rest were gone. They died. No Susan B. Anthony was there with her, but she strode into that polling place and she voted. A presidential election. Warren Harding was the winner of the election. She died 6 years later in Baltimore at age 91. She's buried in Racine. She is there with her husband, the finest man that she ever knew in her whole life. 2 loving children, neither of whom lived in Racine, but they're all buried in the Mound Cemetery, as is her mother. And I'm telling you this tonight because a year from this November, it will be 100 years that the women have been able to vote. And I want all of you, men and women and your friends, to give a silent thought of thanks to Olympia Brown and what she did for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I learned a lot that I didn't know.
I just
just heard the name, but I didn't know much about her. Thank you. Okay, we are at storyteller number 6, T.J.Morris. T.J. not only loves a good story, but also enjoys writing poetry, which sometimes, she says, takes the form of a story. She believes stories are very revealing, regardless of whether they are long, short, true, or tall. And I know nothing about what she's going to tell you, so let's have her up.
Hey, good evening.
Good evening.
Been a good evening, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I hope I can tell a good story. All these storytellers have been so great this evening. Okay, well, I have decided to tell a story about the job market. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. All right. Now, I decided to talk about jobs today because I've had many jobs. Now, I'm sure I'm not the only person in here. There may be somebody else who has had several jobs. I've worked customer service, payment center, collections. I've been a lab assistant, a dental assistant, a teacher, a court reporter. As I was saying, I've had various jobs. Okay. But my most memorable job has been working at the cable office. Has anybody in here ever worked at the cable office? Working at the cable office is definitely an experience. And if you've never had this experience, I'm going to share mine with you tonight. Okay. Now, at the cable office, I worked customer service. And I worked on the phones, so I did basically technical support. I did do some billing calls and I did some sales calls, but my main primary job was answering trouble calls. Now, this was the most stressful job that I've ever had. Being technical support wasn't easy. Now, the first encounter that I'd like to share with you tonight was about this man who lived in a well-off community, and he called the cable office one day. And in my mind, this man is off, relaxing, working a high-stress job, corporate America. He's off on this day. So he decides that he's going to enjoy some of this cable TV that he's paying for. He manages to turn the TV on, and the closed captions are running across the screen. He immediately calls the cable office. Now, of course, I get the call. Right? The man calls the office and he's ranting about the captions running across the screen. He's to turn this off, take this off my TV right now. Now, I'm politely trying to help the man, letting him know that this is a feature in your television. You know, this is not part of cable, and I would assist him in turning this feature off. But he's continuing to holler and tell me that this is not part of the cable and to take it off immediately. Okay, y'all ready? This is the good part. His daughter comes in the room, picks up the remote, and takes the captions off the TV. Now, once again, in my mind, she's a 10-year-old girl who comes in and adjusts the television. Now, I could literally feel this man go, shh. He just shrunk right there over the phone. On my end, I'm going, yeah, yeah, yeah. It's one for our team. I tell you, working at the cable office was an experience. Because you never knew who was going to be on the other end of the line. Sometimes you might get Eric. Now, Eric was a 12-year-old boy who I believe had some form of autism. And he called the cable office often. Now back at this time, you could call the cable office and you could give the name on the account and the address and tell what changes you wanted made to the services. Well, now when you call the cable office, you have to give them the account number. Okay. Well, at that time, like I said, Eric would call, and if he called and he got one of the newer customer service reps on the phone, they would, make the change to the account. And about a couple of hours later, Eric's mother would be calling to get the services changed back. Because Eric always wanted to add HBO, or Showtime, or Stars, or some digital channel, to their services. So anyway, Eric calls one day, and who does he get? He gets me, right? So I have to let Eric know that I know who he is and that I'm not going to change the services. So he hangs up, calls right back. He gets someone else, another customer service rep. Now this will go on for almost an hour. You'd hear people saying, Eric on the loose. Eric is on the loose. Eric on the loose. Be echoing through the call center. Eric is truly one of the most memorable treasures I have from the cable office. Then there were the old people. I don't know what it is about red lights and old folks. Okay, cable would send you messages in the box. They would send you a message to tell you, heavyweight champion fight of the world is coming on pay-per-view. And a red light would come on the cable box. Let you know that there was a message in the box. Well, this woman calls one day, elderly woman, and she's ranting about the red light on the box. So I said, okay. So I'm trying to help this woman, I'm getting ready to help her, try to assist her get this red light off her box. So a grandson comes home, and he immediately gets on the phone. Now he's an adult, and he gets on the phone and he starts to apologize. He says, oh, I'm so sorry. My grandmother, she always calls, the cable office whenever the red light comes on. He said, I know there's a message in there, and I know how to delete the message, and I'll take care of it. And I'm like, oh, no problem, not a problem at all. I said, well, let me assist you. I said, I will instruct you as to how to turn the messages off. So you'll never get another message in that box again. And you don't have to worry about the red light coming on. So he was very appreciative. Now, this woman, she wasn't the only elderly person calling the cable office about the red light. Okay? All I'm saying is that the cable box I have now, it doesn't have a red light. Who knows? I'm just saying. Now, it wouldn't be right for me to talk about the cable office and not tell you all about the good times at the cable office. Now, we did have some good days. The good days were, I'm going to call them network days. Those were the days that the networks came into the office. You had HBO, Showtime, Stars, Encore, those people. Now, they didn't all come in at one time. They didn't all come in on the same day. But they would come in at various times. And when they came in, it was a lot of high energy in the office because there was a lot of raffles going on and games being played and gifts being given out and this type of thing. And you could win some really cool stuff because the things that they brought, they were like limited products of things. This wasn't stuff you could get on Amazon. These were the stuff that they did that they gave out, okay? And I won some nice things. I won a little desk clock. It was a Sopranos desk clock. And then I had won some pasta with the marinara sauce. I can't even say the word. Marinara sauce. And it was Soprano too. So it had the characters and the labels were all characters from the Sopranos. I won a HBO exercise fitness kit. It was supposed to be worth $250. I won a HBO beach chair that you fold up and that type of thing. So we would really have a lot of fun on these days. And if they were giving out baseball caps, then just about everybody would get a cap. But like I said, these were high energy days, and you didn't pay too much attention to the idiot that would be calling in on the phone. So anyway, they would give us lunch sometimes, if, you know, it was pizza, that type of thing. But I still have a lot of things around my house today that remind me of the cable office. But with that being said, I can't leave out one last memory about the cable office, and that's the day of 9/11. Yes, I was working at the cable office on this day. And unfortunately, or should I say fortunately, the cable office, it being the cable office, there's TVs everywhere. You know, because when people call in, we have to be able to check the service to see what's wrong with the channel or what you're complaining about, right? So, as soon as that media feed from those planes hitting those towers hit the TV, every phone in that place went dead. It was quiet. My manager came running out of the office, and he went, "Did you see that?" It was noiseless in the whole call center. Everyone was just watching it as they kept repeating, you know, that picture, that film, you know, of those planes going into those towers. All of a sudden, you could have heard a pin drop because it was so quiet in there. And then I started to think about my girlfriend. She had recently moved to New York. So I called her, or tried to call her, and of course I didn't reach her because everyone was calling New York, and they were trying to get in touch with their loved ones and all that type of thing. Now, upon getting home that day, I got home, I came in the house, and my husband greets me with, "David Oyama was on the second plane that went through those towers." And I went, "Huh? What?" He says, "David Oyama was on the second plane that went through those twin towers." And again, I went, "Huh? What you say?" And then I took that moment to process. And I went, "What? Wow." And that silence swept across the room. My husband lost a friend that day. And we both lost a comrade in faith. We did eventually learn that David was on the first plane, not that this mattered. They both went through the towers. David left a wife and a couple of children. So now every year when 9/11 rolls around, I always think about the cable office, David, and his favorite Buddhist quote, "Behind every great evil, there's great good." Thanks for listening to my cable stories.
Thank you, TJ. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I guess we're wrapping it up now, right? Darlene, anything else? I'm going to do my thanks. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, storytellers. I met new friends and people tonight. TJ, Carol, Vicki, Rachel, Mary. Thank you all. And big thanks to Fusion, of course, for sponsoring this. Giving us a performing arts center for Don Miller. I think the owner of Fusion, did I get that right? Yes. Okay, good. Don Miller and Kenosha Writers Guild, who also helped put this together. Darlene Coleman, Dave Gorjo, Tom Clark, John Bloner Jr., and Lisa Adamowitz Class. How'd I do on those names? And those 5 people put this whole thing together. And her story, that's what it is, right? Her story, women's stories, that's what we did here. So thank you all for coming. Anything else I should add? Can't see. I don't mind learning as I go. That's what we do in life, right? Live and learn. Okay, thanks everybody. We're calling it a night, I guess. Right, safely.